Sebastian, and thanks for stopping by for another episode of MFA Writers. Today we're really excited to share an interview with the uber-talented Chibuihe Obi Achimba, who besides being an amazing poet, is also a current MFA student at Brown University. We've had a lot of listener interest in the Brown program, so I'm happy to get this episode out, just as many of you are hearing back from programs you applied to. Before we get to it, I just want to give a quick shout out to Sebastian, Shlagha Borah, Erika Walsh, Amy Peltz, and James Jackson, all of whom reached out requesting an episode on Brown. I hope you all like listening to this one as much as I liked recording it. You can find MFA Writers on Instagram and Twitter, as well as mfawriters.com. We love to hear from listeners, so feel free to shoot us a direct message on one of those platforms or an email at mfawriterspodcast@gmail.com. And if you have a minute to rate or review the show, the best place to do that is on Apple Podcasts. Doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing writers. Also, if you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show, you can apply at mfawriters.com. Finally, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today I'm with Chibuihe Obi Achimba. Chibuihe grew up in southeastern Nigeria. He's a poet and essayist, and he's currently completing his MFA in poetry at Brown University. His writing has appeared or is forthcoming in the New York Times, the Paris Review, Harvard Review, Poet Lore, and elsewhere. He was awarded the 2021 St. Botolph Foundation grant and the 2021 Frontier Poetry Prize for New Poets. Today, Chibuihe is going to read 3 poems for us.
Life in the village. For years, there was only the exposed midriff of the coal mines, then the lilac-trimmed silence of the hills, then the birds, small soot-drenched robins, in the kitchen rafters, moving in and out of their routine ode. Then the myth that joy was anything more than an accidental crash of dry wings in the wet ossuary of the throat. Then the belief that, given the right circumstance, her old failures could coalesce someday into a full and brand new self. The bird, once rumored to eat timid children, had died multiple soft deaths on her death-besmeared fingers. It happened that she was dangerous, even while afraid. Burial language. Obsidian earth, trapped beneath pink nails. Fingers sifting earth's memories to unshred and stitch back, but she is digging, unholstering the Igbo verb to bury, which doubles as the noun grave. She scratches the corners of her eyes and pulls pirouetting shadows, the things which must be erased forever from the archives behind her tongue. The black acre of language is where history hides its skeletons. See the fog thickening in the word forget. The towns leveled to ruins, the mist she must pass to get to the house and to her father. Bodies and their missing parts litter the square like scrambled letters. Hear the murmur of the alphabets as they link arms like passers-by, constrained to bear witness how they clatter and give way to trembling scales of sobs, how the earth swells to receive her shaved hairs first before the body bag, how her hands cup the blue sky into an O, narrowing a bomber jet into view. Catalog 009. It was a lousy dream. Such dreams were common in the months after the war ended, and the soldiers began to leave town on their motorbikes with empty rucksacks and Kalashnikovs still wet with lead, and the village inched back slowly and without much persuasion into its old cement pillars and beams. In the open-air markets, a surplus of imported American goods in tin cans and opaque bottles tagged with faded blue American flags. Children sprouted dreams in their bed that night, and these dreams began to cling on them morning long like shadows, and sometimes throughout the day. Dreams of Sunday parties and the return of turntables in the streets. It was as unreal as what happened here. Whatever bad memory they went to bed bearing on their foreheads, they erased in the world of dream with dreams. Weeks of starvation and meager rations of milk powder and egg yolks were flushed down their dream gullets with multivitamin and ice. Women replaced the stony faces of the soldiers with the toothy smiles of their husbands and fathers. When children saw oiled gizzards or rabbit heads grilling on repurposed bicycle wheels, they thought of slabs of corned beef and sardines. They say, if you push hard enough, the night will give way to more nights. And they did this with their loud megaphone snores. Moths and cicadas, having lived in this world for centuries, dreamed of ribbons in sealed garment bags and boxes. Owls, too, conjuring nostalgic hours in the mission church, where no candle had dropped an iota of wax since the war moved its hands this way. It was a lousy dream indeed. Laughter falling out of a woman's mouth. Laughter perched on the mangled side mirrors of speeding army trucks, as though it was a line of preening tobacco beds. Stupid you. Did you forget it was in the April of 1968? Did you forget we left Okigwe on a cold and colorless midnight, bursting with crickets and the wail of hyenas? You dragged a flat-tired bicycle, and I pushed stacks of portmanteau boxes up the hill in a wheelbarrow someone had nailed together out of used Melina wood. Of course, the brand-new aluminium roofing sheets and window louvers could fit into no one's hands. And the dolls, we left them inside the bright magenta boxes they had arrived in. A family of squirrels and bats were trapped in the burning rafters. It was hard to look away. The ones who fled the village nailed their family names on tree barks and across the twisted sheen of the footbridge. Those who sheltered inside hastily dug bunkers slept in the bunkers forever.
Chibuihe, that was so lovely to hear you read that, and I'm so excited to talk to you.
Such a delight. Thank you so much for inviting me.
So, when I was reading your work, it's very clear that your home and your upbringing in Nigeria is really important to your writing, right? Like, these 3 poems seem to be set in Nigerian villages. So, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about your hometown, your life there, and why you find it so inspiring to your work.
Yeah, thank you. So I grew up in a small farming village in southeastern Nigeria. And for a lot of people who know the southeastern part of Nigeria, it was it was actually the Republic of Biafra between 1967 and 1970 when the Civil War ended. So very much so, I grew up surrounded by this sort of residue of the Civil War. And then, of course, much of it was shredded in silence. There's this sort of thick silence that you often experience or you often witness in spaces, in locations where something terrible had happened. So, but then it was while growing up, I heard the bits of these stories, and when I was around age 6 or 7, I think I started understanding my mother's story about the Civil War Just a back story. My parents met and married during the Civil War, so that story is somehow part of my family story and my family origin. Yeah. So when I think when I was around the age of 7 or thereabout, I started sort of grasping what it means, to have lived, for my parents to have lived through this experience, and for them to have survived. So, and outside of that, the horrible experience of the Civil War, I think generally, the southeastern region it's an interesting place. And then in my writing, I think I'm always moving or leaning towards sort of a recording, a diary keeping of these fast disappearing village rural life, these bits and pieces that are fast sort of giving way to proper modernization. So in terms of my poetry generally, I think it's difficult to talk about writing poetry or writing generally without talking about where I grew up, the family I grew up in. So I think I was surrounded by grandparents who were traditional African religious adherents. It means that even though my parents, my mother, trained us in the Christian religion, it means that sometimes on specific days you see my mother's uncle sort of doing incantations, and then the poetry and language of ritual sort of captivated me earlier on. There is this sort of beckoning, reaching out to silence, or for me, what I considered silence. But then in that silence, my mother's uncle believed that these deities sort of lived there and they could communicate not with the ordinary or everyday language of communication, but then with the language of poetry, which is the language of incantation. So I think I was captivated by that. And when I finally started writing poetry, it made sense that my poetry would sort of incorporate a lot of apostrophe, sort of reference or beckoning to presence that is sort of outside of my reach, and also my need to use language to summon something. I think it presented itself best in the medium of poetry, because poetry allowed for this sort of reaching out to these beckoning, this sort of the need or the quest, to capture the ineffable. So I think prose didn't give me that sort of permission, or didn't give me agency to think about that the way poetry sort of lent itself, not easily, but lent itself to consider the ineffable.
One of the things I wrote down after reading your poetry was that the characters are juggling their history and their dreams for the future while facing war and violence in the present. And I was thinking about how, as human beings, we're always negotiating between the place we came from and the place we're trying to go to. And so I was curious in what ways you find your past and your history and your language and that Nigerian culture affecting your present and your thoughts about the future.
Yeah, I think I don't know how much of this is a personal. I'm a sad, depressed, sort of generally neurotic person. So generally, I mean, if as far as personality goes, I don't know how much of that is just specific to my own experience as a human being living in this world, and also how much of that is well, I mean, talking about. I don't want to just go talk about historical trauma in this just sort of straightforward way, but I think historical trauma does that to people, that while you fled violence, there's also a part of you that is reaching back. I think not so much to relieve or to recapture what has been lost, but to find a way to articulate that trauma, that incident, what happened, that sort of disconnection, dislocation that happened. So constantly you seem to be reaching back. And I think somehow poets of exile or writers who are in exile, for example, I mean, there is this sort of tangible quality, this longing that is always present in their writing. Not because suddenly they love their country so much, but it's just this sense of dislocation and trying to remedy it, trying to sort of stitch back, or trying to build a bridge between the former self and the new self, between a homeland and then this sense of sort of globalized the globalized idea of home that is that lacks rootedness, that it's not rooted in place or fixed in time.
Yeah, I think that globalization idea was something I was also thinking about when I was reading these poems, because, war is a very visceral and tragic example of cultures clashing, but your poems also explore more subtle ways in which outside cultures encroach on the lives of the characters in your poems. So, for example, in Catalog 009, you wrote, "In the open air markets, a surplus of imported American goods and tin cans and opaque bottles tagged with faded blue American flags." So it made me wonder about your experience now living in the U.S., a country that has for generations encroached on the cultures of others. I'm curious if living here has affected your thoughts on your own culture and history, and if it's magnified the effects of this kind of cultural appropriation and assimilation.
Yeah, thank you. I think, it has. I think it has amplified, our sense of existing, within a sort of continuum. I would tell this story. So before I came to the US, I lived all my life in Nigeria. I grew up in Nigeria. So my relationship with Nigeria, particularly, it's that of a country that is beyond sort of redemption, and then that is due to my own experience as a queer man who experienced violent homophobia that is state sanctioned. But then there's something I removed in my configuration of the world. What was lacking was the idea of not viewing the global world as some kind of continuum. Like Nigeria exists outside of this space, and then America is no paradise, right? So, and then wherever you go, will be a sense of dislocation, displacement, and then particularly we're living in a very politically charged moment globally, and it's not restricted to Nigeria. So, this sense of this idea was lost to me. I couldn't grasp that even if you leave Nigeria, go to the USA, there will still be issues, very present and urgent issues, and issues that would determine your own survival like that. So I think coming to the US sort of opened my eyes, like sort of gave me a certain kind of education, orientation to begin to understand. I think I'm still in the process of making sense of that. In 2020, last 2 years, I wrote an essay about growing up queer in Nigeria and being a Black man in Nigeria. So it was just sort of a response, that stemmed out of my own chastisement. I was trying to caution myself, educating myself that you left Nigeria and for a supposedly sort of paradise. Now look at what you have gotten yourself into, and then it demands a different kind of political engagement. So it demands a different kind of knowledge, a different kind of education, And then for you to be a citizen of the world means that you have to have a literacy in global sort of geopolitics or all of that, So in the poems, what I'm grappling in these poems are stories of people that exist outside of me. They are a generation away from me, my parents' generation, and also it happened recently after Nigeria got its independence. So it made sense that the presence of empire, be it the British Empire or the American Empire, would somehow show itself, because it was a war that was fought locally, but then the players were foreign powers like Britain then, and then America showed up not as an active participant in the war, but then it showed up as sort of providing aid, and then providing care to refugees, and that sort of the Christian missionary group Caritas and the Baptist Church. So I think it's difficult to talk about war anywhere without the presence of the foreigner, and the powerful foreigner in whichever guise, they come in, either as saviors or as armed dealers or all of that.
One thing that made me think of as you were speaking, one of my close friends in my school here at UMKC, Milton Gomez, he's a really brilliant PhD student who's from Colombia. And he told me once that America is a really beautiful country from the outside. And I just thought that was a really interesting, it was really interesting to hear that, from his outside perspective, America seems so beautiful. And then coming here, he had to renegotiate what it was actually like to live here, right? So
exactly, yeah. I think it's the right word is renegotiate, because it just begins from the moment you step your foot on an American soil, be it if you go to the islands or like the Americas generally. Because in Nigeria, I think Nigeria is not isolated, of course. Our education is a little bit of too international for Nigerians' own good. We are exposed to culture, the American media, books, and all of that. But then, and I think somehow it feeds into the question of location, is that your presence in a particular region, it might sound a little bit spiritual, but it's not. I think there's a sort of in psychogeography, if you're talking about that, each place, each cities, each country has some kind of potent psychological impact. It sort of it stirs in the people who live or newcomers. Once you step your foot into America, the tension rises. Not just because of the fact that you're a black man, that is part of it, and I think that is a major part of it. But then your sense of being a foreigner, it happens everywhere. But in this country of immigrants, for example, and it's sort of it's different. Your relationship, your body reacts, produces this visceral response as a newcomer to America, and suddenly you are thinking of history. You're thinking about when was the first time I heard the word America? When was the first time I encountered an American? And how different are those Americans I encountered, say, in Nigeria, different from these ones I'm seeing now? How is their posture? How is their response to my presence here? So this sort of slight awareness builds up, and then I think it's also the moment this renegotiation starts, So in mentally, you begin to map your relationship with Americans and your relationship with the idea of America as a nation state, and then the idea of America as an empire, and the idea of America as a culture producer. So all these stages of relationship, suddenly you begin to question them, trying to make sense of all of that. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the making of a poem, or as you put it before the interview, the anguish and extreme joy of the writing process. I don't know about you, but for me, it almost always starts with anguish and then moves towards the direction of joy when I'm writing. I often start with an idea and then struggle for long periods to find the voice and form and energy that will sustain it until the end. But I write fiction, and so I'm sure it's quite different for you writing poetry. So I'm curious, what does your process look like when writing a poem? Where do you usually start?
I think it's interesting to hear your own relationship to the writing process. Mine is quite the opposite. Like, it's just quite the opposite, because I think it begins with extreme joy, the ecstasy, the excitement of an idea. I live very much in my imagination, so I construct the poem first in my imagination, which is in my imagination it's possible. It's like these incandescent soft, but then process of transferring that to the page is where the anguish begins. Because I think my conception of a poem, it's too beautiful to be true. Not beauty in the way of aesthetics. It's just what is happening in the poem. The fact that language will be made possible, that somehow you can forge the thoughts into tangible material language, right? So so that it's very exciting. But then putting it down on paper means like a journey through language, so between language. There's also, of course, the language of the imagination, which is like mental pictures, senses and like tension, impulse, all these various sort of emotional outbursts that, it's really orgasmic in some ways. But then moving into language becomes very difficult, because you're thinking about vocabulary now, you're thinking about the worldview of the language. My mother tongue is not English, and I don't write in Igbo. So these are sort of multiple languages, the language of the imagination, and then the language of my mother tongue, which I dream and think in Igbo. But the poem has to exist in English somehow. So crossing that over, I think that's where the anguish begins. And then I'm disappointed suddenly that I'm unable to recapture exactly or recapture the urgency of the poem when it first appeared, when it first came to me, So this is where the anguish begins, that I have failed. Language eludes me. I cannot grasp it, So it's just and I'm going to tell you this, at the risk of sounding dramatic, but then I often weep, not because I'm sad, it's just because what I've perceived can never make its way into material language. It's lost. So you have to deal with this constant loss of a fragment. Of an idea, of that sense of place. It's like a painter. I don't know. When you are confronted with an image, a landscape, and you are reproducing it, and suddenly you realize that your palette lacks a specific color, maybe that tone of yellow or red. It's not available. You can't even purchase it in the market. So that is the sort of loss, and I feel, and that is also part of the anguish. I've already spoken about getting lost in translation, this sort of displacement that happens, psychic displacement in a landscape of your own making, a world of your own making, your imagination. Suddenly you lose track of time, you lose your way out of it, So where syntax is so jumbled that you don't know what brought you there, and you don't know how to escape that sort of mesh.
Yeah, but it's beautiful that you try, right? And that we all try to do it, right? Because we have these images or ideas in our head, but those images and ideas come with feeling and come with emotion, and that trying to translate that, it's like you said, trying to paint that color into language is so difficult and maybe in some ways impossible, but to try. And then those moments when you write something that perhaps doesn't quite get to how you felt in that original moment, but creates a similar feeling for someone else that's as powerful. That's maybe the best we can hope for.
Yeah, that's correct. Because my thesis advisor tells me sometimes you have to get out of the way, And then she puts it bluntly, but then that's exactly, just to think of it, that's exactly what is happening. Sometimes the artist has to sort of step aside, because sometimes you have to see yourself as a medium, like things pass through you, and then you are not the reader, as much as it's possible for you to center yourself as the artist and the one creating the work. I think somehow the work belongs to the reader. So, and then when my professor tells me that, sometimes I have to really make genuine efforts to center the reader or to imagine the reader, and how much of this will be clear to the reader, how much of that, my struggle, is actually no struggle, is actually me sort of serving an ego. Because of course, in the writing process, we never talk about how the ego sort of shows up once you open the page, the blank space, the white space. Also, you are staring at it, and then you are not actually seeing the page, the blank space. You are seeing yourself reflected, literally. And then how much of the hesitation, the writer's block, the sadness, it's you sort of trying to please yourself. I take that comment, get out of the way, get out of your own way.
I think you're right that ego does play a big part of it, because we, like you kind of alluded to, we think of writing as something that's ours, that we're creating the meaning in the words, right? But I've been thinking about this recently, that it's impossible to create meaning alone. The writer needs the reader and vice versa to create the meaning in a piece of writing.
Yeah. That's symbiosis. Yeah. I think you, the writer, sort of cannot exist. I think there's an African proverb, a South African proverb actually, that says I am because we are, sort of, so that symbiotic relationship between the writer and reader, sometimes for me, sometimes in my own sort of self-absorption, I sort of forget that there is a reader at the end of the communication chain, like the telephone line, for example. Yeah, so I think it makes sense to sometimes put the reader in the context. Something changed recently for me with this, with my work, with my poems, is that I'm like thinking about my work, my poetry, as being in conversation with my mom. So I usually tend to write very abstract, very sort of out there poems. But then I was running into multiple problems. But then recently I started thinking about because much of the story I know about the war are stories my mother told me, are stories, events, things that happened to her. And then at some point, my mom wanted to be a writer, actually produced this sort of couple of poems, but couldn't carry it forward. Now, what if I'm writing this poem and at some point it will be totally inaccessible to her, for example? So now I'm seeing it as I'm kind of being in communication with her, so seeing her at the other end of the writing process, that somehow, if you are reaching for legibility, you are reaching for legibility because I want my mother to understand what is going on here. So if I'm reaching for historical accuracy, I'm reaching for historical accuracy because I want my mom to sort of confirm, oh, this happened. And somehow there's a joy that comes from it. I've shared a few poems with her, and then she said, oh, yeah. Oh, you remember this thing I told you?
Well, I think that's beautiful. I think, it's for me, for my writing, I like to think of it like an implied reader as well, someone who I imagine the writing is for. And so who better than your mom? That's beautiful. I think that's great.
Yeah, I mean,
So we've talked quite a bit about the anguish of writing poetry or writing in general. So what about the extreme joy that you referred to earlier? What is it about writing, do you think, that is so joyful and rewarding?
yeah. Wow. Joy. You know, the aspect of the writing process that, apart from just the spark of imagination, for me, it's two-pronged. So the first part is reaching for historical accuracy. So I think the project currently working on sort of has a lot to do with history of colonialism in Nigeria, in West Africa broadly, and also the specificity of the Civil War, trying to capture that. Of course, I'm very likely not to. It's not an official document, so I think there are parts of it that will be fictionalized. There are parts of it that language will take over at the expense of historical accuracy. But then I think what gives me excitement somehow is reaching for accuracy and getting it, being specific. It's like when you throw an arrow and then it hits the target. That sort of I think there's a bit of noise, like it resonates. It's like when you strum a guitar string. So when it does that, I think it reverberates and gets to me. I find it really sort of liberating that, yeah, I'm stepped away from this moment, beyond it. I've captured it. The other part that gives me joy is the work itself, what it means to be working with language and trying to render stories, the lives of people who somehow, exist outside of literature. Like to do that, to include them, to write about my hometown, to write about all these small, minute details of growing up and killing a goat and weeding a farm, like bringing it into literature. I feel a sense of empowerment. There's a sense of empowerment that comes from that agency and giving agency to these quote unquote minor characters, and that these people that have been rendered invisible, these people that have been brought out, that exist only on the footnote of history, moving them up into the page or onto the page, centering them, albeit for a moment, capturing a side of their lives that has so far existed in oblivion or unknown. I think that joy, that sense of power, it's not tangible. It doesn't translate into money or fame or anything. But then being able to do that, to render people's lives on the page, and to call it literature, and to call it poetry, and to share it with others, I think there's a joy that comes from it.
That economic aspect you brought up, that's interesting to me, because when I look back at my most joyful moments writing, it was when I was younger and I was just writing something that was for fun, and someone would read it and they would have a positive reaction to it, right? And so I wonder sometimes how that translates to a formal setting, like an MFA program, like a career in writing in which your economic stability is connected to the writing and it becomes a product. So how do you separate those two things? How do you exist in this formal environment of an MFA program where you're supposed to produce, right? There's that word produce, that capitalist term, but still maintain the joy of writing and doing it for yourself and for that joy instead of for someone else?
Yeah, I think I'm going to answer this question and then hope that my siblings, my family never listen to this podcast. Yeah, because I'm Nigerian, and also personally, I'm the first person from my family to go to college, and to come to the US to study poetry is scandalous. Like, what do you mean that you're coming to study poetry? Yeah, but then and then my mom believes that somehow I'm going to make tons of money because Nigerians come to the US and study finance and work in finance and become a medical doctor. But here I am studying poetry. But then, I think separating the economic aspect of poetry and also and separating it from the intrinsic joy it brings, and also separating it from the use of language, the essential work that poets or that we all should be doing with language, trying to restore language, trying to not save it, but continue this process of regeneration, recreating language. So that this is what I've always wanted to do. This is what brings me joy. And then it has taken a long time for me to arrive here. I went to college to study political science, and then after studying political science, I was frustrated, because I knew that this isn't what I wanted to do. Being in class and then going to the library to read poetry, to do all of that. So right now, I feel being an MFA program is the ability to come into your own, this space that you've always craved. Like, dreams are almost impossible to meet. But then this is the first time, like, I feel that I was able to sort of approach and enter and possess a dream, a childhood dream. So I think that, and it's something that you want to keep with you, especially in this world where people are getting disappointed or disillusioned with jobs and all of that. So finally, you are lucky enough to be doing what you've always wanted to do, and what somehow has the capacity to include all these quirks and idiosyncrasies that you've always cherished as a child. You can bring in your toys into a poem. You can bring in like a nonsensical daydream, bring it into a poem and make it meaningful. Render it sort of or dignify it. Because you're working with language. I think that's sort of it's that aspect of writing goes beyond the material and economic aspect of it. I think most nights I go to bed thinking, well, yeah, you're living your dream.
Yeah, so let's talk about the MFA a little bit. Brown University's Literary Arts MFA program is a 2-year, fully funded program that offers tracks in fiction, poetry, and digital cross-disciplinary writing. So what made you want to pursue an MFA, and how did you end up at Brown?
Originally, I came to the US not because of an MFA. I was a scholar at risk at Harvard. I wanted to get an MFA, but my plan was to get it maybe sometime after my 30s, like to live out my 20s without pursuing an MFA degree or getting an MFA degree. But then I think due to a lot of circumstances, I decided to go ahead, since it was in my plan, my original plan. So I decided to go ahead and do it. But before I applied to Brown, I applied for their International Writers Program. So, and then I think I was speaking to my friend, the director of my program at Harvard, and then she said, "You've been writing a lot, and almost every conversation, poetry comes up for you. Why not sort of go ahead and get an MFA?" And then so she said, "Brown, the sort of writing I've seen you do, of all the programs in the US, I think Brown would be the best fit for you." And I looked it up, and it was exactly what I wanted in an MFA program, because I write poetry and I write a little bit of prose and fragments of fiction and all of that. And I do photography, I do collage, I do painting and all of that. So I felt like Brown was the best shot and the best place to go if I wanted to nurture all these sort of multiple parts of my creative abilities.
Yeah, so based on what I've read about the program, the MFA at Brown seems to embrace experimentation. On their website, they say that students are exposed to many literary traditions and anti-traditions and are encouraged to develop their independent voices and unique artistic visions. So it sounds like that kind of embrace of experimentation and that ability to not only write poetry, but work on different types of art while at Brown was something that attracted you to the program. Maybe you can talk a bit about the experimentation at Brown.
Yeah, I mean, the experimentation, there's a way it's used in outside of Brown University. When people talk about experimentation, there's a way they put it, and sometimes I would want to tell them, well, I mean, our workshop sessions are not seance sessions. We don't evoke the dead. It's just like, and then we don't. It's just writing, But I think it just means that there is no restriction. It's unbounded. You have this sort of freedom to do whatever you want, to engage with your work from outside of accepted or traditional modes, to break away from that mode. It's actually encouraged that you learn to break away from that mode. There is something about my cohort is that I don't know how much but from conversation I've had with graduates of Brown, it seems like my cohorts, most of us write what you would call traditional poetry, what you would refer to as traditional poetry, which is like mostly on the page, unlike the previous cohort. So, and I think that has to do with the fact that you are not restricted. You are not sort of corralled into a particular style, or it's not that nobody forces you to do theater or to do sculpture when you are not inclined to do that. So you already have a kind of a vision for your own work, but then you are encouraged to just go a step away to incorporate. For me, for the work I'm doing right now, I incorporate a lot of collage into it. So this is something that I figured I would want to do with this project. I felt that sometimes language is not enough. You have to find another way to communicate what you want to communicate. You want to, if you want to reach for something that is beyond language, if you want to sort of, for me in this project, I'm insisting on leaving a kind of a material trace of colonialism, including it in my work. So in the case of Brown, it was welcomed when I suggested it. It was like, well, this is good. You can do it. And then they shared, my professors shared articles, shared materials that will help me figure out exactly what I want to do. I suppose in other programs, there will be a little bit of restriction, or you will not get this sort of moral support that Brown gives you. So I think that's just the aspect of experimentation. It's just likely based on what you're working on, based on suggestions, and you get enormous encouragement and support, from faculty going ahead with what you want to do. There's no sort of restriction or conflict. Yeah, I think that's the word. There's no conflict. Nothing comes between you and the dream that you or the vision you have for your work.
And there's also this track in digital and cross-disciplinary work at Brown. And apparently students in this track can incorporate materials from a discipline other than writing, such as music, visual, or performance art. So that kind of sounds like what you're describing, that you've been allowed to do that as well. But I'm curious if you know students who are actually in this track and the kinds of work that they're producing in the program.
Yeah, I think that's correct. So I have three of my cohorts. One of them is a violinist, and the other one works with glass, and the other one is a filmmaker. So I think two of them took classes in poetry. So they are allowed to cross-register. I have one of my cohorts who has consistently taken fiction class. The three workshops, register for poetry, and also register in the poetry, and also register in the fiction class. So for my friend who is a violinist, I think that goes hand in hand with the sort of poetry they are interested in. And there's also the aspect of people who work with coding. So there are, I have a colleague who works, a former colleague rather, who works with coding language. Most of the work they do exists outside of material space. So they exist entirely on the ether, creating visual work and soundscape and all of that. So I think you can actually do anything any sort of creative medium you want to engage with in your work. Everything possible: ceramic, glass work, and then clay sculpture, and then dance, visual art. All of it is included. You're free to bring that into your work.
Well, I noticed that in the program, it's a 2-year program, and that students have 2 courses each semester. They take a workshop and then they take an elective. And it seems like the electives can be courses in pretty much anything: literature, history, philosophy, theater, religious studies, studio art, or workshops in other genres. So it sounds like there's a lot of flexibility in what classes you take as well. It's really open to whatever you want. So what have been some of your favorite classes outside of the workshops?
Absolutely. So you are allowed the mandatory sort of course load is you take the poetry or fiction workshop, or the workshop in your specific genre, just one, and then the elective could come from anywhere. So I've taken a course in first person history, and then I've taken a course which I might call my the most interesting elective I took was writing in the community. So because I've always cherished the idea of writing that exists within a community that incorporates elements of social justice, activism, and community building. So last spring, I took this course with Eleni Sikelianis, Writers in the Community. Before the spring semester, I was planning on starting a literary journal for queer writers on the African continent. So I figured that if there's a course that will give me hands-on skill to sort of go into, that would be this writing in the community, So, and it was really fantastic. It was one of the most exhilarating classes I took, more so because we had to work with students in the local elementary school, like teach and talk to them about writing and reading. So it sort of existed. It was writing that existed outside of the academic space, that went into the community. In most cases, I think it was the pandemic that stopped it. In most cases, the class goes to prison, sort of goes to community centers and interact with the locals, start writing workshops and lead them through maybe a couple of sessions, creative writing workshops. So I think it was the most interesting because it came at the exact same time I needed that sort of skill, So then I was able to put it to use almost immediately. So my project for the class was starting the literary magazine. So, and then it took off.
What's the name of the magazine?
It's Chiku Magazine.
Okay, well, we'll be sure to put it on our website so that people can find it. And then you also told me that you think of the MFA as an apprenticeship, an opportunity to read all the poetry books that you had no access to in Nigeria. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that was me also going back to Nigeria. So in the southeastern region, there is this sort of economic system where apprenticeship, it's sort of very popular in the southeastern part of Nigeria. And it literally means you go study under someone or learn a trade with someone. So for me, I think of the MFA program as exactly that, an apprenticeship. It's just this window to consume, to really dedicate your time, and for me, what I find really important in the writing process is to read. Much of that is to make up for my lack of exposure to books when I was growing up. So I grew up in a small town. I didn't have library. I didn't read my first poetry until I went to secondary school, actually. So it's just like I think somehow I don't know how much of this is true, but I have this sort of overwhelming sense of inadequacy. And someone who enjoys reading poetry. I think there's a joy in reading poetry, not writing, in being sort of participating in a poet's world, in their creation. So I think for me, this MFA program specifically is helping me do that. I have tons of poetry books, and it's providing the resources to buy the books. Is I can go to the library and pick up books almost every day without feeling guilty, like you could just read and get the support you need. And in terms of the writing process, talk to professors, like email people and then, oh, I'm working on this material. Would you mind sort of reading and making a comment? And then you get it instantly or maybe before the week runs out. So I think that experience, it's comparable only to an apprenticeship, to where someone is sort of responsible for your development, in this case, literary development, Except that, well, in southeastern Nigeria, if you are graduating from an apprenticeship, you get a donation from your boss. But then, well, in this case, there's no donation. So.
Don't hold your breath on that one, I think. Well, okay, so you mentioned support. I want to talk about that a little bit. So, like you said, in an apprenticeship, you'd be working under a professional of some kind and getting clear support and guidance on how to do something. Have you felt at Brown that you've gotten that kind of support and guidance from the professors in the program? And specifically as an international student, have you felt supported and comfortable at Brown?
I think I will answer it before the international student part because thank you for that. Yeah, really. And I think for most part, I've been a needy student. I've always been a needy student. I mean, to put it bluntly, yeah. So I think Brown has given me this specific targeted support, not as an international student, So it's hard for Brown because Brown sort of insists on a certain independence, artistic independence. So, but then when you reach out, you get support. It doesn't come. It's not part of the program. You're expected to work outside, to exist outside of the department, to do most of your work as, an artist, it's not a colony, so the sense of community is tangible and felt, but then it also sort of prizes independence. But once you reach out to professors, to the faculty, you get immediate response. And I think for me, from my first year, I've always constantly reached out, and then in whatever way that I sort of think I need support. So I've done 2 independent studies. Yeah, so I think it's really it's not common for a graduate student to get 2 independent studies in a 2-year program, But I've gotten that because I made my request, and then I prefer working one-on-one with professors. You don't do well in workshop settings. And that has been available to me, which I'm really grateful. But in terms of international students, there are no targeted support for international students. I think actually the opposite is the case because there are sort of opportunities that are available to American students or MFA students who are Americans that are not available to international students. And it's not an institutional thing. It has a lot to do with tax system in the US. So there are some kind of grants that you cannot access because, of course, of taxing and all of that bureaucratic baggage. So, but then if you're talking about general support, it's available, but then you have to ask.
And I mentioned that Brown is fully funded. So according to the website, all students receive fellowships in their first year and teaching assistantships in the second year, during which you teach 1 undergraduate writing workshop per semester. So are you currently teaching?
Yeah, that's correct. I taught last semester rather. and then also doing my final teaching this semester.
How's it going?
Fantastic. I think it's the greatest introduction to American culture, teach undergraduates. So, and then it's been really eye-opening, and also it gives you this stride. You're talking about poetry, but then talking it as somehow a master. You're not a master, but like there's this authority which makes you, second guess yourself at home so that you don't second guess yourself in the classroom. And then it also broadens your view, and you develop a different kind of engagement with poetry because this time you're trying to pass it on to students. Yeah. So last semester was really interesting because the poetry my students submitted last semester, I was constantly amazed by the quality of it and by their deep engagement and interest in poetry as an art form, not as this sort of diary keeping, as an art form. It was really mind blowing, and it's also happening this semester. And then at Brown, you have the opportunity to design your syllabus. So you do every aspect of the teaching work. You design, you teach, you grade. So it's a full course load here, and yeah, you mentor students, and so I also appreciate that aspect of it because being entrusted with that sort of amount of responsibility. And then you also get training, adequate training before the teaching starts. So pedagogy is really stressed.
Yeah, so it sounds like, carrying over from that idea of flexibility and experimentation, being open to new ideas. That's cool that they allow you all to kind of design your classrooms the way you want to design them as well.
Yeah.
And I'm curious also about your life outside of the classroom. So I saw online that Brown has a visiting writers series where poets and prose writers come and speak either in person or virtually. And it seems like they do that once a week. So I'm curious if you've attended any of those, what they've been like, or other events. What's life like in Providence, Rhode Island?
I mean, Providence is a small town, but it's I've lived in just 3 cities in the US, but it's one of the most interesting places I've lived because it's very intimate, and then it's very artsy. There are galleries and there are artists, I guess, because there's the Rhode Island School of Design. So it's sort of this cross-pollination. We are allowed to register courses at Rhode Island School of Design. And of course, talking about this, we have to talk about how much the pandemic has really destabilized and disrupted the art scene or the writing community. So most of what we have events is virtually. So there's the Writers on Writing, which is a course that Brown, the Literary Arts department, offer to undergraduates every semester. So it's through these Writers on Writing that artists, writers, both locally and internationally, are invited to the department. So, and then MFA students have the opportunity to do have a one-on-one meeting with them. So before the pandemic, it was in person. So, go for dinner, chat, conversation, and all of that. But then now it exists only virtually on Zoom, but it still happens. So we have opportunity to meet with the writers, the visiting writers, and to meet also with one writer in residence, poet and fiction writer here. So I think that those opportunities to create community and expand community exist. And Providence is really the sort of place, city you live, and you feel this sense of community. It's intimate, like I said. And then the writers, if you don't know a writer, you know an artist, or you know an artist studio where you can, just drop by and communicate or chat with them. And then there is always an exhibition, a reading, a poetry slam happening somewhere. So it's this very small town that if you're bored, it's maybe because of some other reasons, not because something is not happening. And then there are the gay bars for me, and then the Eagle and all of that, which features prominently in my writing life. So,
well, before we go, I want to ask you one last question. This is what I ask every guest when they come on. What is one thing that you think Brown does really well? And what's one way that you think they could improve?
What Brown does really well is the experimentation aspect of it. Because if there's one thing that the writer needs, is that sort of independence. and having their curiosity sort of supported and not stifled. So that is one aspect I would want them to continue really, because it has meant a lot for me for my work, And then the other aspect I would really, it's just the same thing, but the extreme, the consequence of this independence is that it's difficult to foster community in terms of like formally foster a community. And I think that is going to change because there is the Brown Arts Institute, which was just recently started. And then we also this department is in the process of hiring a new chair. This conversation about community has featured prominently in the conversations we're having with these prospective candidates. I think so that, and also catering to students whose interest exists outside of this sort of genre. There are students who come to a program and then they want commercial sort of success, or they expect to create communities outside of the writing space. So I think opportunities for those students should also exist. So that it's not limited to people whose inclination is towards the experimental, because it's one thing to have these things available, and it's also another thing to just leave them hanging because no one has specifically requested for them. Yeah?
Well, Chibuihe, I know you're in your last semester, and so you're working on your thesis. So I just want to wish you all the best of luck in finishing that, and best of luck in whatever you decide to do next. I have no doubt it's going to be amazing. So just thank you so much for stopping by and chatting with me for a bit.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the work you do, and also good luck with your own thesis and your writing life. Looking forward to reading your work sometime and then visiting this podcast. Thank you so much.